Well, here's a new article that's just came out August 4th of 2021, and it's kind of a secondary verifier of some things that I've been saying in recent videos. One that comes to mind is the series that I did on sacred geometry, and in that I mentioned the fact that it went back much earlier than Pythagoras himself, and the Pythagorean theorem seems to have been around before him, and that whenever he figured it out, he probably just figured out what they were actually doing before and what they were using and how the math all worked, and then it all clicked, and eureka, like they said, and he rendered off his clothes and went screaming through the city. We can find that associated with Sumerian knowledge a lot, actually. In fact, the guy that was deciphering Sumerian tablets in the first place, once he finally got it down and he figured out that he was looking at a tablet to describe the Great Flood, but from another point of view, he had the exact same reaction. Discovered 3,700-year-old clay tablet shows Babylonians used geometry long before Pythagoras. Scientists have once again found proof that our ancient ancestors were more sophisticated than previously thought. There's much more to learn from cuneiform tablets or the earliest systems of writing invented by the Sumerians, but one has to know what to look for, because sometimes what you search for is hiding in plain sight. If you've been with me for a while, you realize that this is one of the fields that I actually studied in, and I didn't really do Egypt as much, and did what they called Oriental studies or Middle Eastern studies. And I really steered clear of the Bible type of idea of things, but was really searching for all the people around them and associated with them in great civilizations. And at the time that I found out about the Sumerians, I remembered that we heard about them in school, but they really gave, I think, 2 paragraphs to the concept of there being an ancient Sumerians and what they had brought to the world. Just kind of a sidebar thing. But then all of a sudden I found out they knew all of this stuff, and one of the earliest teachers that I had made a mention of the fact that a lot of the reason that this wasn't really told or really shown out was because of that biblical fact, and the fact that it was showing where that original tale came from, and a lot of the other tales and situations, words, and places can be found in these tablets from this civilization. I became real interested in it, and while I was studying it, we got to look at microfiche, and I went through hundreds, if not thousands of them, and a lot of them had labels below them that would tell you what this scribble that's all around here on the bottom and the top and in between the lines were about, or just what it said. A lot of times straightforward, no type of connotation to what it had to do with and everything. A whole lot of these tablets were listed as being mercantile, or they were something that was governmental. And they just had boxes and boxes of these. But once I got out of school and they finally started the proto-internet, actually before there was an internet, there were people hooking up like the internet, and it actually made it. And what we used to do to tap into this would use a Wildcat bulletin board system. And this is where people could contact back and forth, but they would have hubs, and you could have people call in and attach into your computer, into the area that you had for such things, and there were menus, and a lot of times it would be documents and pictures, although pictures were really hard to download. This picture that we were looking right here would have been something that beforehand would have been cropped to where it was much closer to the circle that you were looking at, and you might have seen the fingers holding it. That's about it. And even though this is probably 800 by 600, back then we were lucky to get anything that was 300 by 400. And it would still take minutes and minutes and minutes. I mean, I remember a lot of pictures would take 20 minutes to download. And I downloaded hundreds of them to look through them. And then went through that and compiled them onto discs that we used to have back then in 3.5 discs. I remember having a 9600 baud and going up to a 14.4 Cardinal, and it was like lightning in comparison. But of course, that's nothing compared to the amount of rates that we do nowadays. So the menus they had in there, you would have been able to click on them nowadays and just view each picture and then back click and click the next one, back click and click the next one. But a lot of these tablets, it had declamations of people's land like this, that what you're looking at is somebody's land that's being hacked up a little bit. And this is perhaps a few people's land, and what they're declamating is that one person out of this group here, which we don't know how to read the symbols, but it's showing you that one person out of this group, like maybe this one, where it has a little diamond onto it, and it's declamating this. See, the problem with the Sumerians is they used to have to make tablets and keep them, because every year whenever it flooded over and it came through out of that, the boundary markers would get screwed up and everybody'd have to get back with it again. And old Mr. Jenkins keeps trying to nudge into my palm tree forest over here, and you know, we've been through this before, but here we go again. And they would declimate things out off down the river where it burps out into it, but just like we do nowadays in plots of land where we cut that out and we field it and turn it into a field and then plant it in rows and everything. You know, these people were doing this a long time before. So when I was studying it before, they said that they had math, they had higher math, because there was tablets that had big numbers on them, and we got to experience a little bit of that. But as I was looking at all these, I was like, there's a whole lot more going on here. And you can tell that this is about something, and they just weren't sure. They didn't seem to want you to get into that too much either, or start making ideas about what you thought about it. But some of these tablets would show land and things like that. There were other ones that this one on it said that there was disaster, and that they showed a line cutting across, and it was in an arc. And after being in geometry 1 and 2 for a couple of years here, I was easily able to look at that and go, what they're doing with these lines across here is it's declamation. And they're plotting something out along a line. And this isn't some guy's property or something. This is stars or doing something, but there's something with this that meant that it was bad for them. And it's a bad omen or something. Of course, if you've been with me for a while, you know that with D&D, and I go, I wonder if I could turn this into something and figure it all out. No, it wasn't about that. It was about, well, it was kind of a bad omen, but bad things happened off of this and so on. And it had to do with this thing that they had declamations across the sky. What was weird about it is over on the side they had all these Sumerian numbers and tables leading up, and it looked like whenever you table something in and you put something in bar down below it, and like you're going to add it up and make a sum or so on off of it, but then there's no line below it like we do and a sum going out of it. Trying to figure out what it was. Come to find out later, they figure now that that was some asteroid meteor that had come through and struck, and these people, which I used to have a video pulled up ready to make one, but I haven't gotten to that point on it yet, about they believe that it's one that hit in Austrian mountains. Wasn't that big, and it was kind of a bolide event, but left over was a bunch of meteorite. And that they had declimated it coming across. And I was like, aha, well see, I kind of knew that. And there's a whole bunch of other ones that are declimating where they're looking at the stars, it looks like apparently, and they're plotting the stars versus something that looks like a constellation. And so one of these things is moving, and though the stars all move at night and everything, you can figure out what the heck's going on here. Well, that's one of those planets. They knew well about them. And back then, if you started making conjectures like this, they really didn't like it too much. Although you could tell that they had already figured out that the planets were equal to the people, and Saturn and Nergal and all that stuff, and which one goes with which. In fact, one famous tablet has Nebo as Mercury and so on, and people knew about that. But let's get into this one little tablet here, because one little tablet can show you a whole bunch of stuff. This thing looks like the size of a biscuit or a hockey puck. It's written on both sides too. They'll tell you about that in a minute. It's a hand tablet from 1900 to 1600 BC, created by an old Babylonian surveyor. It's made out of clay, and the surveyor wrote on it with a stylus. And this is from the University of South Wales, Sydney. This is what happened to a mathematician from the University of New South Wales who found an extraordinary clay tablet that has been hiding in plain sight in a museum in Istanbul for over a century. You see, what all it takes in that case where I was too is somebody that knows something about geometry and mathematics, and with that idea, maybe you could get some more knowledge out of it, right? Well, this unique 3,700-year-old clay tablet is the oldest example so far of applied geometry. But it also offers an ancient mystery to scientists that they can't solve just yet. According to a new study published in a Foundations of Science, the tablet known as SI 427 was discovered in the late 19th century in what is now central Iraq, but its significance was unknown until the University of New South Wales scientists did their detective work. So, ancient Babylonians used geometry long before Pythagoras. SI 427 dates from the Old Babylonian or OB period, 1900 to 1600 BC, says the lead researcher Dr. Daniel Mansfield from University of New South Wales Science School of Mathematics and Statistics. Oh snap, this is exactly what you need. You know something about geometry too? Yeah, well, of course. It's the only known example of a cadastral document from the OB period, which is a plan used to surveyors to define land boundaries. Notice the name is cadastral. Has to do with the stars also. In this case, it tells us legal and geometric details about a field that split after some of it was sold off. This clay tablet shows Babylonians used geometry long before Pythagoras and has thus rewritten the history of mathematics. There are museums that have boxes and boxes of these, and it's just looked at as being these documents that they kept, legal documents, whatever they want to shelve them up under. But just take one and put it in the right hand of the right people, and all of a sudden we learn something more about it. This is the great ziggurat of Ur. This is something like the stairway to heaven that Jacob spoke of. Well, it's supposed to be a ladder. Yeah, you'd have to go back to a pretty primitive time to have a ladder that you'd have to go up. This is Stairway to Heaven maybe more in a Led Zeppelin theme. The whole thing is made out of sacred geometry. It's squared off. Those niches that you look at on either side of that great causeway that goes up there are all certain sections and amounts and differences of amount that they've declimated that wall in. And they've done it for structure and architecture. And it's weird, it's one of those things where that could have been done on the inside and you could have had a flat wall. But they wanted to have some style right off the bat, because already in their reed work and everything that had led up to them having this stonework here, they had some style in it. And whenever they got a hold of this land here, which really wasn't abundant with trees, but when they got a hold of it, there was a whole lot more greenery, and they ate up all the wood, and then they started having to use sacred forests that were far from there. There are a lot of tales about that sacred forest. In fact, the tablets of Gilgamesh tell tales of that sacred forest. It's also mentioned in your Bible, though. It's also mentioned by the Egyptians. This up the rivers there now is the only place that it's left. Places that used to be sacred cedar forests. To say that 10 times fast. But these sacred cedar forests had dwindled away to the point of it. And you look at certain times whenever they put these big orders in for it, and they were going to end up putting new roofs on all this, area, make all these doors and do all this, plus this, and how much they got from each one. So I wonder we have very little left of it in a modern time. Huge cedars, Christmas trees, basically. The discovery and analysis of the tablet have important implications to the history of mathematics, Dr. Manfield says. For instance, this is over 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. As I stated before whenever we were going through this, that Archimedes and some of the things that he learned is a culmination up to his point that he had gone through, and perhaps that Library of Alexandria and so on, and ended up figuring out all the stuff of these people the Medes had before time. Because we talk about Archimedes' screw, and it's definitely known that these people had it, and it predates them by hundreds and hundreds of years, like 600-800 years at least, for these Babylon gardens that are all talked about, and one of the 7 great wonders of the world. Well, it was said that they used this type of device by a few people, and so that tells you it predates it. Hell, it has to be more than 4 years ago now, but I've got showing through the ruins of an ancient not just looking at the ziggurat there, and in doing so we can find there's a Roman arch. So when does the dating of Roman arches, is it a Roman arch? Really? All these people find out the same thing, and you come to find out there was a lot more connections that you want to give with these ancient people in ancient times and what they knew and knew from before. Things that have long disintegrated and gone away or burnt away. In 2017, Dr. Mansfield conjectured that another fascinating artifact from the same period, known as Plimpton 322, was a unique kind of trigonometric table. So what was weird about this trigonometry is it was one of the tablets that are showing this declination, and it's like plane geometry, trying to figure out distance in situations, and whenever something's going at a distance as they go. You can picture a horse rider being on a field going away from you at an angle, and you're trying to figure out how far they are at each time that they're going and where it's going versus a certain point. Well, in this version, it was a version in the sky towards the point they were at on the ground. It is generally accepted that trigonometry, the branch of maths that is concerned with the study of triangles, was developed by the ancient Greeks studying the night sky in the 2nd century BC, says Dr. Mansfield. Oh no, it works off of that. The trigonometry works, of course, works off these 3 points. You know, if you give me 3 points, I can figure out where something is versus a certain point. The Babylonians developed their own alternative proto-trigonometry to solve problems related to measuring the ground, not the sky. The tablet revealed today is thought to have existed even before Plimpton 322. In fact, surveying problems likely inspired Plimpton 322. In other words, well, this isn't the first one at all. I mean, this is just another in a series of so on, and if they were trying to figure out the earliest ones, they have the same situation going on in this proto-cuneiform. So it was going on back then. Now, if they figure that out from there, they could probably find the same situation. But, see, these are kept in a library, and apparently there are like 2 of them made, and they fire them, and they keep one, and you take one, so you can say where your land is and what you have going on, and this is me, and they find that tablet. So some of the numbers on the tablet there have to be kept in sequence. So they had these shelves of this thing, and you can imagine whenever they start to get a lot of farmers going on, they have this whole sequence here. You know, ancient bookkeeping. There's a whole zoo of right triangles with different shapes, though, but only a very small handful can be used by Babylonian surveyors. Plimpton 322 is a systematic study of this zoo to discover the useful shape, says Dr. Mansfield. This is another one that we're not looking at. Tablet purpose revealed survey. Oh, well then Plimpton 322. That's not the one I'm talking about. I just now caught this even after reading through this earlier, guys. Plimpton's the one where they're trying to figure out the different ways that they can break up this piece of land for this lady. And in doing so, they're using triangle shapes. And of course, 2 triangles put bisected makes a square or a rectangle. And so they can make ultimate rectangles and try to break this down. But what they're not liking is that it keeps making it turn into a piece of like Tetris where it's jagged off here and there, and they'd really like to break it down correctly. But because the starting form that they go with is a little off, and they're trying to fit it in between 2 sets of land, they're figuring out the problem, and in doing so they're figuring out which triangles can be used to do for her land, basically. With this new tablet, we can actually see for the first time why they were interested in geometry to lay down precise land boundaries. Dr. Mansfield says, this is from a period where land is starting to become private. People started thinking about land in terms of my land and your land, and here's the boundary, and da-da-da. Wanting to establish a proper boundary to have positive neighborly relationships. And this is what this tablet immediately says. It's a field being split, and new boundaries are made. There's got to be hundreds, if not thousands of them, but there's a tablet talking about where the people share what's on the fence. And that instantly flashed to my parents, where the people behind us had a pear tree, but half of it hung over on ours. And they said, you didn't have anything on your side for sure, da-da-da-da. Well, my mom started making these pear preserves and gave them some of them out of it, and said, try it on your waffles, try this, try that, and everything, just on a biscuit, whatever the hell, you'll probably like it. Wasn't too long before they were asking her if she had some more of that, and then how did she make it. And so Mom gave her some of it to last her, and she said, next year when we do the crop, I'll show you. And she went ape with the idea, and canning and so on. And whenever she passed away, there were still a few jars from that time that we actually had. If I remember, there was something like 80 something jars was what we had. And we, of course, give some to some, and my Uncle Charles liked it and everything, so we'd occasionally give some to him, my brother, my sister, and everything, da-da-da, and it still got down to the point that there was still some of that left. It's a pretty good size tree, though, but you can imagine whenever you have a few trees between each one and things can happen. Of course, they didn't have canning methods to that availability, but it sure did help out a whole lot. Neighborly relationships. There are even clues hidden on other tablets from that time period about stories behind these boundaries. Well, kind of like that one there. Another tablet refers to a dispute between Sinbel Apli, a prominent individual mentioned in many tablets, including SI 427, and a wealthy female landowner, Dr. Manfield says. Well, see, this first one we were looking at, like I'm saying, there was different people's land over there, so apparently this was in check there for a little while, or these were big farmers of it. One of them was a woman. The dispute is over valuable date palms on the border between their two properties. The local administrator agrees to send out a surveyor to resolve the dispute, probably again, and it is easy to see how accuracy was important in resolving disputes between such powerful individuals. So they try to give ideas on why they would come up with geometry, and once they got it all down, and it was, you know, you could set up some stelae, some stones, and you could say, okay, well, we're all coming to agreements with this, and we're shaking hands, and I'm going to put stones down through my way here, but it all gets washed away in the flood type situations and get screwed up, so they'll have to get declamations of that done again. And he moved that stone. All these things happen. Well, these tablets reveal also affect that something that we don't actually see in these tablets, that there was this master tablet that they figured out how long each person's land was, and they had that declamated to where whenever they had these disputes, they at least had a starting point to go from, and then maybe they'd have to measure your neighbors and then yours and then the ladies, and then turn around and go, okay, hey, there's something off by a foot here, there's something, you know, things like that. I remember my parents and the people behind them had a dispute with it, but it wasn't really a dispute. It was the fact that the guy, that whenever he built his fence behind us, he built it a foot into our yard, and that he knew it, and that if we wanted to, we could push our fence out another foot if we wanted to, but our fence lined up with everybody, so it didn't make any sense. But that's how we did the fences that hooked up to each other. So, you know, I think we just let that one ride. But whenever he put up his professional fence with his da-da-da, he moved the fence, and that was before my parents got the property, ha ha ha, and the in-between or whatever. Like he pulled it off, ha ha ha. Come to find out whenever we moved in, yeah, he had the new fence suddenly. So Dr. Manfield says that the way these boundaries are made reveals geometric understanding. Nobody expected that the Babylonians were using Pythagorean triples in this way. Dr. Mansfield says it's more akin to pure mathematics, inspired by the practical problems of the time. Creating right angles is easier said than done. One simple way to make an accurate right triangle is to make a rectangle with sides 3, 4, and diagonal is 5. These special numbers form the 3, 4, 5 Pythagorean triple, and a rectangle with these measurements has mathematically perfect right angles inside of them. This is important to ancient surveyors and still used today. It was used by the ancient Greeks like crazy. I've had somebody in one of the videos where he shows that before Pythagoras, there's buildings that are using this concept and this sacred geometry, and for the squares and the cubes and so on. And again, I refer to my one on sacred geometry, but one special one that actually showed Donald Duck and the times of Pythagoras and about what they knew and da da da. And kids used to be taught this type of thing, but it's amazing that we realize that it goes back well over 1,000 years before that with these ancient Sumerians. And if you look at some of these sites without a tablet and date them out, you can find that they still were hooked up in angles to places where it lined up as far as crops go with the solstices and things like that, but also in size and relationship. In fact, I did a video here earlier this year that showed that whenever they looked at Göbekli Tepe and the people that could do this type of geometry and had the measurements exactly, figured out that, hey, you know those 3 Stonehenge looking things that are in Göbekli Tepe that date back to 10,000 BC? Well, those are based on a Pythagorean triangle and a theorem that's built off into it, the same thing. I have videos on both of those. The ancient surveyors who made SI 427, though, did something even better. They used a variety of different Pythagorean triples, both as rectangles and right triangles, to construct accurate right angles, Dr. Mansfield said. However, it's difficult to work with prime numbers bigger than 5 in the base 60 Babylonian number system. This was a key, and this was also a key whenever they figured out trigonometry, because in that trigonometry, the math that they were looking at never made sense to anybody, and they threw it into the bucket again, or the box. But then somebody that knew about that and the relationship between numbers, and even though it was silly, the numbers in sequence kind of rang a chime in this guy, and he's like, oh, they're doing this. And then after looking at it, figured out, hey, this is trigonometry, but it's based on 6. So again, this mathematics, statisticians, and people like that, what you wouldn't think of as being an archaeologist, right? So it works out and helps a whole lot. You know, down the hall from Indiana Jones, there's somebody he could talk to that had with math and things like that, and maybe he could turn around and go, you know, I get this tablet here, and it's got all these numbers onto it. What does this mean to you? If the guy literally took a look at it, might be able to find out something special. So this raises very particular issue. Their unique base 60 number system means that only some Pythagorean shapes can be used. So even though there are Pythagorean shapes that are outside the boundaries of it, they were only willing to use certain ones. And this also shows that ideal of sacred geometry. Something that was so hidden, it's talked about as being the Mies of the Sumerian that you hear about in the tablets, that somebody else might take away from us, and then we'll forget, we won't know. What is that? Mathematical equations? ME? It seems that the author of Plimpton 322 went through all of these Pythagorean shapes to find these useful ones, and this deep and highly numerical understanding of the practical use of rectangles earns the name proto-trigonometry, but it is completely different to our modern trigonometry involving sine, cosine, and tangent. Well, yeah, it's not something you could plug in on yours unless you could get into it and say, figure now for hexadecimal or base 60, which strangely enough, once it goes from your hands into the computer's based on hexadecimal, which is based on that 60 situation. It works with it better, actually, than what you're doing, and works through it. In fact, their mathematical formula that this guy figured out that they are using, now I've got another video about this, so you can just look up Sumerian trigonometry. It'll show you that they figured it out, and it's actually an easier to do formula, and probably something that you can do in your mind almost once you get it down real good, but that it seems to be even more accurate. Yet it's easier. It's one of those things that's like, wow, and they had that all on. So, again, I flashed to that moment whenever they were saying, well, you know, they had math and even big numbers back then. They used to cut things up in little shapes. through this, my lifetime, if you will, has turned into a totally different situation. And people have made a lot out of it. And of course, then we had the Sitchin thing that made far too much out of some of it, in my opinion. But then we're left with that overshot the mark to where people aren't even looking at the reality of what really happened. Well, they already had a lot of it going. Well, where did that come from to lead them? That's what I kept looking for. So hunting down SI-427, Dr. Mansfield first learned about this tablet SI-427 when reading about it in excavation records. The tablet was dug up during the Sapar expedition of 1894 in a group in what's called the Baghdad province of Iraq today. It was a real challenge to trace the tablet from these records and physically find it. The report said that one tablet had gone to the Imperial Museum of Constantinople, a place that obviously didn't exist anymore. So, hey, yeah, that's a more modern version of one of the guys that figured out mathematics. There's another guy that's with him that has a gray hair with him and everything that's next to him, and they figure it out. They've got a chalkboard behind him, but that's whenever they first did. I'm sure this has got popular enough to where they had to make 20 vids for the locals and so on about it. Using that piece of information, I went on a quest to track it down, speaking to many people in Turkish government, to ministries and museums, until one day in the mid-2018, a photo of SI-427 finally landed in my inbox. That's when I learned that it was actually on display at the museum. Even after locating the object, it still took months to fully understand just how significant it is. And so it's really satisfying to finally be able to share this story. Next, Dr. Mansfield hopes to find out what other applications the Babylonians had for their proto-trigonometry. There's just one mystery left that Dr. Mansfield hasn't unlocked. On the back of the tablet at the very bottom, it lists the hexadecimal number 2529 in big font. Think of it as a 25 minutes and 29 seconds. I can figure out what these numbers mean. It's an absolute enigma. I'm keen to discuss any leads with historians and mathematicians who might have a hunch as to what these numbers are trying to tell us. Oh, I don't know, man. Whenever I hear declamations of minutes and seconds, I always think of geometry hooked up to our planet, hooked up to the web that's around it as far as longitude and latitudinal lines, and I wonder if in any way that 2529 was some way of declimating that block that was on that tablet that those people lived in. And if they found another tablet that was close to it that was called 2528, or may have been done a different way, maybe it was 2429, 2329, and this was the 29th precinct. Maybe it works along that line. Or maybe from a certain point, but you'd have to figure out what that was, that this was how far in declination they were from that point of reference. They were 25 minutes and 29 seconds differential. That's how they do it on the sea and things like that and work off of it. So, so there's hunches, but I mean, of course, that's simplistic, and I'm sure they already went through that. Wonder if you can think of any other thoughts, but I'm thinking that's their address, and inside that address is the whole block. Call it a precinct, call it a whatever you want to, But they knew that this is the one. And so if they know that there are other tablets with this other guy mentioned on it, declamating perhaps other disputes or other things, on the back of those tablets, does it have that same 2529 and the other tablets that are associated with this that look exactly like it? Do they have a different number but close number? Or, a different number altogether? Where you could start making assumptions and work off of that, right? So, yeah, I'm sure that's the guy there. That's the young guy, and the other one's the older guy, and they're two mathematicians got together. Two guys plumbing. It's amazing what you can find out. What I'm doing is trying to get back up to the tablet here so we can finish it, or better yet, the great ziggurat of Ur. What all did they know? Well, they figured out how to bake tablets for writing and things, but also bricks. A lot of people think of bricks as being a real modern thing. Almost in those nursery rhymes when you're a kid, you think of bricks as coming last, right? With the three little pigs and the way that it goes. But how old are bricks? It's amazing, the first bricks that make up the ziggurats and the mastabas here in Sumeria are the same size, pretty much, as the ones in Egypt, and that concept and connectives. A lot of things that I've shown in my videos, especially some wiki article things that I've been able to go back through lately, are really showing the fact that things that I, 4 years ago, made a video about that was pseudoscience, and that there was a portion here when they talk about pre-dynastic Egypt that it may be, but it's been kind of dismissed, but is no longer even pseudoscience or even a theory, but it's just got its whole page because it's been confirmed and verified enough times to where, no, well, that happened. To what exact degree might be left up to contention, but that happened. But again, whenever I was studying it, to bring up ideas like that, sometimes we get books shut in your face. It's crazy, isn't it? But people get caught up in their dogmas. But then as we slowly go through these things and find out situations, and somebody finally looks at these tablets enough times, and strangely enough, this guy's got some geometry background and trigonometry and things, and he's able to look at the numbers that are associated with that and go, what? Maybe that has to do with these points here, because it looks like they really did cube this thing off right. They cut off certain sections, and they did this in a certain way. I wonder if it says on the top of it that right here is the river, Euphrates, running through, or is it here running through? And if they buffer up against it, and these people's land and their connections, where does it come through? There's a little bend at this corner right here. Maybe it comes through there. And they were in this little section. Maybe the water goes right through there. It's pretty cool. But then again, like they started off saying in there, sometimes you could be looking at a tablet and you'll go, oh, this is just some administration tablet, and then blah, 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 something about land, toss it in this box. Whenever you really ought to take a secondary look at it. You might find out that Pythagorean theorem was going on a lot longer and earlier before you even thought so, and geometry and all these things. Why did we never know it before? Well, it was sacred. That's the form of secret. Can you keep a secret? Some people could back then. Like, share, and subscribe. We'll get on to our next one. Peace.